morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us in the world. My name is Corey Nachreiner. We'll get into that in a second. But today we are going to talk about our Internet Security Report, specifically the Q3 edition from 2021. I'm sure you're all noticing we're in 2022, but we're always kind of a quarter behind as we have to analyze the data. Before we start, it's probably good for us to introduce ourselves. My name is Corey Nachreiner. I'm now the Chief Security Officer at WatchGuard. Used to also be the CTO. Among other things, it means I get to do one of my favorite things, which is manage and start the WatchGuard Threat Lab with Marc here, who I'll hand it off to.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. So I'm Marc. I run our security operations team, as well as help manage our threat research team, the WatchGuard Threat Lab. And like Corey said, that's the fun part of the job, where we get to go and analyze data that we get from our threat intelligence feeds, from third-party sources, from our own first-hand research, and really try and paint a picture of what the threat landscape looks like so we can turn around and offer you guys some tips on how to defend against the latest threats we're seeing.
Yep.
And it's not just us that writes this report. We get a lot of help from the rest of the folks on our team every single quarter. Just a few of the names in the bucket here that helped out with this most recent version. And again, man, 39, I think 40 pages or so on this one. Definitely wouldn't be done without them for sure.
For sure. I'll even mention that me and Marc started this report. I think I made the first outline for it, and we pretty much broke it up 50-50 between us. But this is the first report where, other than reviewing, I haven't even wrote a section. So thanks to this awesome team that puts together every quarter under Marc's leadership. With that, let's quickly talk about the agenda and dive right in. So it's pretty simple. We kind of follow the outline of the report if you've ever read it. We're going to start by talking about the Firebox feed. I won't go much into what that is because Marc will in a moment, but it's essentially any threat intelligence we get from the Firebox. And the things we concentrate most on in the Firebox feed, it starts with malware. So what is the top malware we see from a network level? Then we also pay attention to network attacks using IPS. And of course, because of great DNS firewall services we have, like DNS Watch, we're able to tell you about some of the malicious domains we're seeing leading each quarter. Now, because of the acquisition we made over a year ago now, Panda Security, now WatchGuard Security, has both Adaptive Defense 360 and WatchGuard EPDR. And between both of those, we have a great view of malware from the endpoint level. And we find quarter over quarter, what you see at a network level always kind of differs from the endpoint level. You know, at the network, you're seeing droppers and stagers, and at the endpoint, you actually see payloads. Every quarter, we try to also have a research topic, or if we don't have a new research topic, we talk about a top story of the month. And while it might seem time is definitely different during the COVID eras, but it seems like Kaseya was a long time ago, but it really happened at the beginning of Q3. So that was July 2021. We'll talk about the Kaseya ransomware attack. We won't go into this section in much detail because we had a huge webinar on it. Hopefully you got to see that, but there's more in the report that Marc will kind of give you a high level of, and you can check out more in the report. But as you should know if you've watched this presentation before, the point of this Internet Security Report and webinar isn't just to kind of worry about all the badness out there, rather to pay attention to the trends so that we can make sure to protect against the badness we see. So throughout this presentation, especially at the end, we'll give you tips to preventing and defending against some of the threats we're talking about. But with that, why don't we go ahead and talk about the trends we see from the Firebox feed, and I'll leave it to Marc to introduce this a bit for you.
And I guess before we start, the badness is probably my new favorite InfoSec word. I feel like I definitely see that coming up on the CISSP exam.
Exactly, the badness. People don't like that I call threat actors bad guys either. It's too juvenile, right? But come on, they're bad guys. Everyone gets it.
100%. Anyways, so starting with the Firebox feed, like Corey mentioned, it's basically built from the data that we get from users like you and administrators like you that have opted into sharing that with us. When you set up your Firebox appliance for the first time, you have the option to check a checkbox to send device feedback back to WatchGuard. It's also found after the fact in the general settings under Policy Manager or the Web UI if you want to opt in. And along with some usage information that product management uses to figure out where they should focus our efforts for the coming year, we also get anonymized threat intelligence anytime your box blocks a malicious attack. That could be a trigger from any of our 3 anti-malware services, the IPS engine, or any of our other security services as well. And all of that comes back to us, where we analyze it and we try and identify these trends across the world of where these malware attacks and these network attacks are coming and what they're attempting to do. I mentioned it's built up of 3 separate layers of anti-malware. When we started this report back in Q4 of 2016, I think we just looked at a single layer at that point, really. But we've expanded to include not just the signature-based gateway antivirus, but also intelligent AV, which uses machine learning and AI to try and predict whether something is malicious or not, as well as APT blocker, which is the behavioral sandbox-based detection, where we send a file up to a cloud-based sandbox and detonate it and watch its behaviors to come to a conclusive thumbs up or thumbs down on whether it's good or bad. On the network attack side, it's built off of intrusion prevention detections, which isn't just exploits in web applications you expose to the internet or websites or servers, but also on the client side as well. We actually see a lot of detections come in for browser vulnerabilities that your users might inadvertently trigger as they're traveling across the internet looking at or landing on potentially sketchy sites or compromised websites. And then I guess it's been a few years now, we also include DNS Watch as well, so our DNS firewalling service, where we can look at connections on the DNS level, so name resolution, and identify predominantly phishing attacks and related, but also malware connections, command and control connections, and malware delivery networks as well. So with that, let's go ahead and hop on in, I guess.
Yeah, and we'll start with the highlights. So I'm going to cover a few here. Marc can kind of dive in with color if he likes. I will say Q3, one of the themes was both malware and network attacks dropped a little, both of them, not a huge amount. And in fact, if you actually look at the number of devices reporting in, we might have seen a little uptick in malware detections per box because fewer boxes reported in last quarter. But overall, both malware and network attacks dropped a bit. So you can see some of the highlights here. First of all, our sampling is always pretty good. We have a pretty statistical relevant data with always over 30,000 boxes reporting in, but we've been over 40 before, so we are seeing a decrease in participating fireboxes. Overall, detections using GAV, our traditional malware service, was about 8.7 million. This was a decrease, acute quarter over quarter. Notice though, APT blocker, which is the last behavioral service Marc mentioned, detected 7.2 million, a small increase. And it's always, we'll talk about zero-day malware later, or malware that evades more traditional signature-based protection. But advanced malware is definitely high lately, so pay attention to it. One of the big themes from this report, though, is we continue to see a high amount of malware coming over encrypted connections. So for instance, by the way, only some fireboxes decrypt HTTPS, or it's the TLS that's used to encrypt web traffic. I would say right around 20 or under % of fireboxes actually turn this capability on. But from those devices reporting in, you can see just about 70% of malware that arrives at these devices is encrypted. So you can imagine the 80% of people that don't have this turned on are missing 70% or almost 70% of the malware that might be arriving at their firebox. So we really heavily recommend folks use this free HTTPS decryption feature. It takes a little work to get it going, but when you have it, it's going to protect you from a lot of malware. And before we dive into a polling question, I'm not sure if Marc had anything to add there.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to point out is those that have read our report or seen these webinars for the past 2 years, you've seen these APT blocker detections continue to trend up year over year. Like it used to be when we first introduced the feature, like it always had a huge amount of hits, but it was always a bit behind traditional signature-based anti-malware, just because GAV is the first step in the anti-malware tree that we have. And it does a good job of quickly identifying a lot of the known threats that are out there. But in the last few years or so, we've seen APT blocker detections continue creeping up to the point where I think it was 2 or 3 quarters ago, it came within like a few 100,000 detections of the signature-based anti-malware. And I'm willing to bet we're only a few quarters away from it surpassing signature-based detections, just because of how easy it is these days to take any old malware payload and add polymorphism, add packers or cryptors that make it really easy to sneak past some of these legacy anti-malware engines. Again, 8.7 million detections is nothing to scoff at when it comes to an anti-malware service. So it's still a critical layer in your security, but it's just one layer. And you need to make sure you've got those additional anti-malware layers behind it to pick up the slack too.
Yeah, later on,
And
we'll talk about endpoint, where we see a lot of scripted or let's call it living off the land malware, and that also is something that signature based is less capable of detecting.
100%. So let's hop into our first polling question now, actually, which is, so regardless of the appliance that you have, hopefully a WatchGuard Firebox, do you inspect HTTPS traffic at your perimeter? So do you do HTTPS decryption in order to identify the potential threats that are coming in over those connections? And then while we wait for the results to come in, like I started in support 10 years ago, and so I've definitely helped organizations set up this feature before, and I get that it's not just as easy as checking a checkbox and you're done. Like, it takes some work. You need to have a public key infrastructure set up. You need to have either Active Directory deployed or set up your own certificate authority or figure out a way to distribute certificates off your Firebox. But it's absolutely necessary work for making sure that all of your layers of security are working. And so if we look at the results here, right around 50% of you actually do inspect HTTPS traffic, which is great. And it is higher than what I'd say our typical norm is that we see from other telemetry. So I don't know how we draw statistical relevance from that. Maybe if you are the type of person that likes to listen to us talk about the latest threats, then you're potentially more security minded and also setting up HTTPS inspections. So that's pretty good on you. But still, there's still a good half of you or so that haven't, or at least are working on it as well. And like I said, and like the stat Corey mentioned, like if you aren't using HTTPS inspection, you're missing a huge chunk of malware that's just slipping past multiple layers of your security at that point.
And we get the working on it, though. It's to get this to work, it does take some certificate setup. There are easy ways to do it on the Firebox, but one thing you do run into, even when you set it up quickly and correctly, is because of certain standards like cert pinning and things like that, there can, or clients, for instance, a client that maybe does HTTPS slightly different or forces a certificate when you're using a client rather than a normal web browser, there can be little issues, but exceptions should work well in those cases. So don't, it's not overly hard to set up. You will run into issues occasionally with the site, but remember, that's normal. Use the exceptions properly, and you can get it working for 95% of your traffic well and have the right exceptions so it doesn't cause user friction. It's well worth going through that work, even though we do know it is some work. So with that, let's start talking about the malware we saw during Q3. We'll start, Marc and I, with some of the top 2 by list, and then we'll dive into a few examples of some details. So the first list I'm going to look at is the top malware by volume. So this is pure raw numbers. What threats are we seeing most often, regardless of how many times per device? And you're looking at the list here. I'm not going to cover every single one. We do see a lot of similar malware come back every quarter. For instance, Creox, Heim, D, and Harry are ones that have been in different places on this list every quarter. Heim D did rise to the top again. It hasn't been at the top for a while, but it did. But I will talk about a few of these more named ones. For instance, the one called generic KD, that's SBD in parentheses. SBD is actually an off-brand version of Netcat. So if you're in the industry, you know Netcat is a cool network utility that basically allows you to open raw listening or communicating ports on your computer. However, it's used quite often in the attacker world just as a way to receive communications from a Trojan or a backdoor. You can use Netcat to open a listening port so that when your malware calls home, you pop it open, and vice versa. If you're on a victim computer, you can pop open Netcat to start sending stuff to that computer. So SBD is just kind of this alternate version of Netcat that we're seeing a lot. I will mention the Moon popped up. The Linux generic actually catches a lot of different malicious Linux scripts, but lately we've been seeing by hash most of these are the Moon, which is a well-known Internet of Things exploit kit targeting Linux devices. So we talked more about that in past quarters. I won't talk about it as much here, but it continues to stay in the top, showing that bad guys are targeting network IoT devices, Linux-based ones using malware like that. There's two Office exploits. One of them is new to the list. The 2018-08-02 is kind of new to our top 10 list. The one below that from 2017, 11882, has been here on and off quite often. But to be honest, at the highest level, if you don't go into the details of the vulnerability, those are essentially the same. They're vulnerabilities in something called the equation editor, which is a component of Microsoft Office. You can imagine what it does. Its name is pretty descriptive. You can make equations. So it's used for Excel and Windows or Word, all the other Office products too. But we're seeing this 2018 vulnerability, so a different vulnerability in equation editor popping up a lot more. Basically we'll talk a little bit about it later, I believe, but you can get an Excel document, you open it, and next thing you know, it's downloading malware on your computer. The final one I might talk about really quickly is application Linux WinExe, which seems weird, but the truth is that's actually a remote desktop, a Unix-based remote desktop. So think of VNC or RDP on Windows, same type of tool, but it's kind of one that works well in the Unix Linux environment. So that is new to the list and was interesting to see a remote desktop popping up. Let's take a look at the top threats from a slightly different perspective, and I'll hand it over to Marc.
Yeah, so we mentioned that a huge number of these threats come in over an HTTPS inspected or encrypted connection as well. And so we like to take a look at those specific ones that a lot of organizations are missing too. And like Corey mentioned, there's a lot of downloaders and droppers that we see throughout our lists in general, because acting at the perimeter, we typically see that first stage in the malware. And if we're able to detect it and block it right there, then it's done. As opposed to the endpoint, which we'll get to a little bit later in this discussion, where if it arrives on the endpoint, you're typically going to be able to see the additional stages of that attack as well. When it comes to the top encrypted malware for this quarter, there's a lot of returnees in here. In fact, there was only one brand new one, which is this Tier Spear downloader, which is a pretty exciting name in my opinion. But in reality, it's just another popular stager that attackers are using, where if they can get this onto an endpoint, it'll typically fingerprint the endpoint, figure out what operating system it's on, what architecture it's using, and then go and download a additional payload to drop on that endpoint. In our analysis of this one, we found that it was predominantly dropping both the Razy botnet as well as the Agent Tesla remote access Trojan, which are two pretty common threats that you'll see in our top list and even in this encrypted malware on its own too. It seems like botnets and remote access Trojans are still, unfortunately, here to stay. And Agent Tesla seems to be a really popular one that attackers have been using lately.
Cool. And then we'll round out the malware section with a few more things, but let's talk about some of the standouts. One of the vulnerabilities, by the way, you might call this a malware, but it's just, a CV is actually a vulnerability, but it's also the signature we use for malware that's exploiting the vulnerability. So as I mentioned, CV 2018-08-02 is new to our top 10 list, but is actually an older Word and Excel Microsoft Office issue involving the equation editor. And we find it interesting because there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have affected the equation editor over years, which we do see in our list a lot. And basically, I mean, like all with Office flaws, basically that means if you open a specially crafted document, it can usually execute code on your system, and that means silently download and install something else in most cases. Remember, unlike macro-based threats, this document doesn't necessarily have to have a macro in it to work. Sometimes, depending on the vulnerability, there might be features you have to turn on, so you might get user warnings saying this has active content or this has links, and you have to approve that. But I think this was one of the flaws that just worked if you open the document and weren't patched. But basically, the threat we monitored, Trevor, who's one of our analysts, looked at this threat and noticed Excel spreadsheets. I think they were often coming as like delivery-related emails that had a spreadsheet. And if you pop open the spreadsheet, it leverages this flaw to download and install malware. Specifically, in the case we looked at Lockybot. Lockybot is one of the remote access Trojans Marc was just talking about that's evolved over the last, I guess 7 years now. It came out in 2015. It's known mostly as a Trojan information stealer. It will get on your system and try to steal any passwords and keys it can and share that with the bad guy through a command and control channel. So basically, beware of unsolicited Word documents coming in email. You get Word or Excel spreadsheets all day long as a business, but you get them from people you know, and you usually get them around tasks you're working on, meaning you expect them. You need to make sure your users, they're probably well aware of not interacting with executable attachments in email. No one's crazy enough to do that. But a lot of people don't realize that documents and spreadsheets can be dangerous. So make sure your users know only interact with ones you expect. If they're unsolicited, even from people you know, maybe ask about them before opening them up. Another one, I don't know if I'll do a good job pronouncing Grubor, GE31, but
Sounds like the Kraken's goalie.
Yeah. This one actually didn't make it in any of our top lists, but we thought it was interesting. We often go, since so many of the things we see in our top lists are repeated, we sometimes go a little deeper to see if there's anything interesting. And Trevor has a great write-up on this. It was 16th by volume, so not in the top 10, but it also used a different, Office remote code execution vulnerability to execute and do something bad. And in this case, what it would do is download the Agent Tesla botnet, which you just heard Marc mention. It's a botnet we've seen over and over the years. But one of the interesting things was this actually uses fast flux DNS for a command and control. And what that usually means is the DNS entry the bad guy's using for the command and control is probably tied to his botnet. Fast flux DNS just means when they register a domain, they being a bad guy, they register some domain to use for evil, they don't want that domain to be, or they don't want the IPs at least behind it to be taken down. So they put a very short time to live on the domain itself, so it keeps on having to go and get new IPs. And basically then they attach it to a botnet so that every few minutes the domain name is connected to a totally different IP in their botnet. And it's one of the ways they kind of evade authorities because you can take one of those IPs down, 60 seconds later, there's a new one. So interesting that it used that. Not uncommon, by the way. Fast flux is, for an old, cynical grandpa security expert like me, one of the oldest things in the book. So let's finish out with zero-day malware, Marc.
Yeah, and for those that I'm sure have listened to our webinar every single quarter, probably doesn't need an introduction, but just in case there's any new folks in here, when we're talking about zero-day malware, it's different than a zero-day exploit, so a unpatched vulnerability. And when we say zero-day malware, we mean malware that doesn't have a signature, meaning it gets past some of these legacy signature-based anti-malware services. There's a few reasons it couldn't have a signature. It could be brand new malware that was just developed and the engines haven't had a chance to create a signature for it yet. Or more commonly, it's actually old established malware, or at least easily spotted typically, that attackers have taken some extra steps to try and mask it from these signature-based tools. On underground marketplaces, not even on the dark web, just on regular old hacking forums, you can find for free or for just $10 different tools out there to help you mask your malware from signature-based detections. I mentioned packers and cryptors are pretty common. There's a really popular one out there called Amber that's even just for free on GitHub right now, where you can take any old payload and with about a half second of work running it through this tool, that payload will still work, but it will get past a lot of signature-based detections. And so long story short, in Q3 of this year, that zero-day malware number was at right around 67%, which is just over 2/3 of all malware then is getting past legacy signature-based anti-malware services. So we always talk about layered security and why you need multiple layers of anti-malware protection, both at the perimeter down to the endpoint. And this is exactly why, because if you're just relying on a single layer, and if that single layer is signature-based, you're going to catch a lot of threats, but you're going to miss even more coming through it. When we look at malware that came in over an encrypted connection, that zero-day percentage was actually a bit lower than we've typically seen it. In previous reports, we've seen it higher than the unencrypted zero-day malware number. And we feel like this quarter, it's largely because of a few specific threats that tended to be pretty easily caught by our signature-based protection, making up the bulk of the volume that came through. So just because it's less than 50% doesn't mean you can really let your guard down if you're using HTTPS decryption. In reality, that's still half of all malware you'd be missing if you went to the steps of inspecting your encrypted traffic and not adding those additional layers of anti-malware services on top of it.
Cool. And I guess we'll round out and end the malware section by quickly just talking about the regionality. So the chart you're looking at now is actually weighted by fireboxes. We sell fireboxes all over the world, but if we did this raw numbers, countries that just have less fireboxes than other countries would seem like they had less malware. So this is actually weighted by firebox, so it is the right percentage, including how many fireboxes are in each country. But as you can see, just looking at malware detections, almost half the malware in Q3 was detected in European, Middle East, the Europe, Middle East, and Africa, or the EMEA region, which is a little bit unusual. I mean, usually EMEA is high, but is usually not so much higher than the Americas, because we tend to also have a lot of Americas detection. The other thing is APAC is at one of the higher percentages. We tend to, over time, even with the weighted, see APAC is having slightly less malware than many regions, but this time it's relatively close to the Americas. So not much here other than whatever country you're living in, you know how much malware you get in average. I will say one reason you would still read the report after this webinar is we do have a section of it where we talk about malware by region and more specifics, where we show certain malware and the top 3 countries. So certain countries like Australia, Germany, the US, UK, there's certain malware that affects these countries more than other countries. And it's always interesting to see and consider the why there. So be sure to check out that chart in the report if you check it out. But with that, let's transition to network attacks, or IPS. And I'll let you lead this off, Marc.
Yeah, so network attacks come from our intrusion prevention service engine, which is a signature-based engine that's regularly updated, sometimes multiple times a day, to try and catch not just attacks targeting servers and web applications, but also clients as well. And over the last couple of years now, we've seen this continued trend going upwards of more and more attacks every single quarter. And this is despite over a large chunk of this trend, a lot of the workforce transitioning to working remotely, meaning they're not necessarily behind the perimeter firebox appliance that is triggering all these attacks. And we typically figure that was because even though people are working remotely, doesn't mean they don't need to access resources on the company network. And a lot of times, instead of using a VPN to securely connect into that network, administrators will instead expose these services to the internet. Obviously, some of these need to be exposed to the internet, like Outlook Web Access, if you've got your own local Exchange server, different applications or remote access applications, for example. But when you expose these to the internet instead of through a VPN, you leave them wide open to attack from cyber criminals. And they typically run automated scanners across the entire internet address space, trying to fingerprint what version and what applications you're using, and then running those against a known database of vulnerabilities and attempting those vulnerabilities against those exposed services. Now, this quarter was actually the first time in well over a year that we've seen a drop in IPS detections for the quarter. It was a bit of a small drop, only about 1 million or so. We still finished above 4 million, which is still the second highest we've had in the last 3 years or so. But it was a bit of a drop. Don't really have a reason for that other than potentially, I don't know, maybe all the attack or all the bad guys got sick as well and took a few days off too. But it was still around 116 attacks blocked per appliance, which is, I mean, well over 100 attacks in the quarter is nothing, again, to scoff at in that regard as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in actually to look at the top 10 network attacks that we had for this quarter. And Corey, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. By the way, Mark, I think they were just taking a break in Q3 before the holiday rush. They do
That's
tend to do a lot of
probably it.
attacks over the holidays. So this is the top 10 network attacks by volume. By the way, I believe we have it by widespread network attacks in our report too, so you can check that out. Not going to cover this in a ton of detail because really for IPS, what shows up in the top 10 seems to repeat quite often with the stuff you see on this list. We see a lot of different cross-site scripting generic attempts. Cross-site scripting is a type of web application attack where if the web developer isn't kind of sanitizing the type of input that users could put in, whether it's directly in URLs or forms on a website, or even that a smart attacker can sneak into headers that a web server might look at. But if they're not monitoring that and kind of cleaning it, it might offer a way for an attacker to actually inject some script that the website runs as its own. And sometimes you see it demoed with benign pop-ups, but it can be really dangerous. There's things like the browser exploitation framework, which you can pretty much gain full control of computers via websites that have cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. But this list pretty much stays relatively similar. I think it's in a large part, Marc talked about automated mass scanning. We assume that a lot of the vulnerabilities we see IPS trigger on are just kind of being done through vulnerability assessment, whether a good guy or a bad guy. But one interesting, though very old one, should up on the list is the web remote file inclusion vulnerability in Etsy password. And what isn't really discussed in that name is this turns out to actually be a very old vulnerability that, for among other things, affected IIS servers. Way back in, I think it was 1995, I think it affected IIS servers 4 and 5, so that kind of gives you an idea of how old it is. But it was one of the big vulnerabilities involved in NIMDA. If you haven't heard of NIMDA, it was one of the IIS kind of worm malware similar to Code Red that came out. By the way, NIMDA is just admin backwards. So a very popular threat that came out in the early 2000s and wreaked quite a bit of havoc with IIS servers. Don't need to go in all the detail, but the truth is there's two different vulnerabilities NIMDA uses with IIS servers. One was the arbitrary code injection vulnerability having to do with backslash characters in the combination with 2 dots used to do directory traversal. And then, of course, another one. But long story short, that flaw you're looking at is one of the flaws associated with those old attacks. By the way, there's a lot of other reasons bad guys would want to get to Etsy password WD using vulnerabilities like this. It's a way to get hashed passwords from a Linux server and potentially do offline cracking. So that was really the only new one in the report. We go through a little bit of history of this vulnerability in NIMDA if you check out the report. But as you can see, the rest, what I think is interesting is most of these, not all, but most of them are web application attacks. And a lot of them are generic signatures catching generic cross-site scripting, generic SQL injection, and generic brute force attacks. So if anything, make sure you're protecting your web applications. That starts with secure code development. Check out OWASP.org, the Open Web Application Security Project, or have your web developers check that out to learn to avoid the mistakes that these attacks try to take advantage of. But you may also consider a WAF in the future. With that, why don't you talk about the regionality, Marc?
Yeah, and again, this is the weighted numbers for this last quarter. And even after weighting them based off of the number of appliances that we have opting in any given region, the Americas still blew the rest of the world out of the water in the number of attacks that they suffered in the last quarter. Now, almost 2/3 of all network attacks we saw in Q3 targeted systems in North America, Central America, and South America. It's really difficult for us to say exactly why they had this focus over the quarter, because again, a lot of these attacks tend to be some of the automated scans. But basically, if you have one takeaway from this, if you've got a network with exposed services in the Americas, make sure you've got IPS and other protections enabled, especially HTTPS inspection for those connections coming inbound through your perimeter too, so you can catch some of these threats as they're attempting to hammer away at your server. Because the thing with automated scans is they tend to, I mean, they're not always successful, but all it takes is one. Basically, if the attacker can get one single successful attack against one of your services, that's all they need to initiate one of these more long-standing APT style attacks against your organization.
And think least privilege. I mean, there's obviously things, services that for production reasons you have to expose to the internet because they're customer facing things. But make sure to use least privilege for anything you expose. We live in a pandemic world, so one, remote management. There's probably things in your network you want to remotely manage. And two, just remote connections like terminal services, remote desktop, VNC. I get the use of those, but you really want to limit the privilege of that thing. Marc will talk in brief about Kaseya later, and Kaseya all started with the central manager being exposed some to the internet. And I get people want to remotely manage things, but you don't want to expose anything that has to do with remote management to all of the internet. It's better to, in the worst case, expose it to a limited access control list, meaning only a list of IP ranges or IPs or domains or like dynamic DNS that you want to allow in. Or even better yet, if you've heard Marc and I say many times, use a VPN and then do what you want. But the less you expose to the internet as a whole, the less you'll show up on these type of scans and have network attacks that you have to worry about IPS looking out for. With that, let's go ahead and talk about DNS Watch. And I'll go ahead and give a quick intro to this and let Marc highlight a few things. So DNS Watch, as we mentioned, is our DNS firewall. It makes sure that even if with the right training, if a user does accidentally click on something to go somewhere they shouldn't, we can block it and catch it. Or if you have malware on your computer that's trying to beacon home as a botnet to a command and control channel, we can catch that too. Our DNS section has 3 different subsections we talk about. Compromised sites. That is a legitimate domain, or it was at one time legitimate, therefore a real reason, a legitimate reason, but either it got somehow, hijacked or taken advantage of and is at least temporarily serving malware, or as you'll learn, some we put on the list as a proactive security benefit for you guys. The malware list is kind of a list of servers known to be delivering malware. So it might start with the domain, but those that add that domain, there's a service there that's helping, the attacker deliver malware to different victims, either by drive-by download attacks or just being part of the infrastructure to deliver files to bad guys. And I guess phishing sites, you can guess. This is a site that's going to kind of pretend to be legitimate. Usually there to lure you to share your credentials or some other information. So those are the 3 types we list. One of the most interesting and new things in compromised I'll let Marc talk about is autodiscover.apas1.com, a legitimate domain, but I'll let Marc cover why it was a big issue in Exchange.
Yeah, so you might have actually remembered hearing about these auto-discover issues earlier last year. I think it was towards the end of Q2 or so when researchers discovered that when Outlook on your client, whether it be your phone or your laptop or whatever, attempts to figure out which server to log into when you enter in your email address and password, it actually goes through a list of different variations of your domain name.com or your domain name at its TLD or your domain name at various auto-discover domains, sometimes including regions. And the list can be upwards of like a dozen or so different combinations of your domain name with something that it goes through to try and figure out exactly where it can log into. And they found that as part of this vulnerability, as we'll call it, at each of these spots, if that domain actually existed, it would attempt to go through the authentication process, which means sending those credentials to that domain, that destination. The researchers found that Microsoft didn't actually own a lot of these domains in the list, and some of the combinations that would pop up as Outlook attempts to authenticate your email address into a server. And so they surmised that an attacker could basically squat on some of these domains and register something where if for some reason your email domain was down, or like maybe they fat fingered the URL in it, it would eventually wind up at some of these ones under an attacker's control. And if they set up a service that looked like Exchange, Outlook would attempt to authenticate to that and willingly give up your email address and your password to try and start that authentication. And so this was pretty big news when it came out. There were thousands of different domains not owned by Microsoft that researchers found were being actively exploited pretty soon after the fact. And so we added a whole bunch of those to our DNS Watch threat feeds and found in very short order a lot of block connections going to these. And this is a bit of a nefarious incident because it's difficult as an end user to realize that this is going on behind the scenes. Like if you click on a link or type in something into your web browser, you can hopefully pretty quickly see relatively quickly that you've landed up on a potentially sketchy site or potentially fishy site. But in the case of these auto-discover bugs, it was Outlook behind the scenes sending your credentials to all these different domains without you knowing. And so without a service like DNS Watch or another DNS firewalling service to kind of block those connections, it's possible that you were losing a lot of your credentials without even realizing that this was even an issue. And so that was the top one by volume by a pretty substantial margin under what we called compromised sites. It felt like the best category for it in that situation. A few of the other standouts in the other categories, though, you'll see at the top of malware, this Belsys CDN one. We actually found it delivering several different malware payloads over the past few years. Things like Mass Miner, which is a crypto miner that exploits the Eternal Blue vulnerabilities from, man, that feels like ages ago, 2017, I think. Wormable vulnerabilities, where once it gains a foothold on your network, if you haven't kept Windows up to date, it can use that to spread automatically, as well as a few other remote access Trojans as well. We saw this xvpn.ug show up too, delivering a few more remote access Trojans, one called Amati, one called Remcos Rat. Some of the lower profile ones, as opposed to, Agent Tesla that we see pop up just about everywhere else too. And then in the phishing domains, you'll see more subdomains of SharePoint continue to pop up. And this is still, like, I feel like we've talked about this every quarter, still attackers abusing the fact that you can go register your own subdomain for a Microsoft or Amazon or Google Cloud owned parent domain and host whatever you want on it. So in this case, they're hosting websites that look like a valid Office 365 login. It's on a SharePoint.com subdomain to give it some more credibility. And if you're just highlighting over links and that's your only check to determine whether it's good or bad, you might fall for this and willingly or unknowingly give up your credentials. So we go into a few details on some more of the domains we popped up in here. One thing I forgot to mention at the start of this, these are all malicious domains. Don't go enter them into your browser. They could be hosting malware or drive-by downloads. Definitely check out the report if you're interested in them and avoid visiting them yourselves unless you really know what you're doing on sandboxing your connections. That's it for the Firebox feed. I guess now we can pivot into some defensive tips that we had for the quarter. And Corey, I'll let you take the first one.
Yeah, and I'll start by just going where Marc led with the auto discovery flaw. Mostly because of that, but for other reasons, it's important to protect your Exchange servers. Again, we've mentioned this in past reports, but in this case, we're mostly talking about that auto discover issue. And just so you know, for it to work, the way it's kind of the unscrupulous auto-discover domain owner is doing this is taking advantage of ways that HTTP basic authentication works. So one of the things you can simply do is disable HTTP basic authentication on your Exchange server. And beyond that, disable auto discovery in exchanges policies. I think after that particular issue, you'll find a lot of documentation online and from Microsoft to do that. So that's the first tip is harden your Exchange servers, don't use HTTP basic authentication, and make sure not to use auto discovery if you can, or auto discover.
Yeah, and the next tip is really protect Microsoft Office, and more broadly, just treat Office documents with skepticism when you receive them. We're all probably familiar now, and even untrained users know that if an executable attachment somehow winds up in your inbox, you probably don't want to download that and run it. But Office documents can tend to fly in under the radar and trick a lot of users into opening them and potentially executing malware. Like there's vulnerabilities out there that are still 0-click. All you have to do is open up the document and boom, it's done. Luckily, Microsoft has done a lot of work behind the scenes to try and limit the ability for those style of attacks to actually execute. We've seen that for probably a decade now with security warnings about macros. We've seen them add additional warnings for other active objects, and they even have now safe mode for opening documents enabled by default in most instances. That's that bit where you'll notice if you open an Office document from an untrusted source, you have to click that enable editing button before you're able to actually touch it. What they don't do a good job of advertising is that enable editing button also allows a lot of these objects to actually execute and potentially exploit a vulnerability if you haven't kept Office up to date. And so make sure that if you're allowing Office documents in from untrusted sources, you've got security services inspecting those, and make sure that malware delivery is a part of your phishing awareness training to your users so that they're aware that even something as potentially benign looking as a Word document can still be that gateway to allow malware to execute on your system.
And the final tip is kind of a catch-all we always use called network segmentation, or better yet, zero trust. We joke about zero trust if you've seen our predictions for this year, but despite joking about the term zero trust as just meaning the least privilege principle, it is true a lot of people don't apply it internally. And what we mean here is, Marc always makes fun of me when I use the Tootsie Pop analogy that most networks have a hard and crunchy exterior, but a soft and chewy center once you get in them. So once I pop one computer, it can be the most worthless computer to your network. You may not care about it at all, but if it's on your internal network, I now have an internal bastion host to do all my lateral movement as an attacker. And it's been found over and over again, without internal segmentation, it's pretty easy for bad guys to sniff network credentials, Kerberos tickets or hashes, replay them, and in like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, it's usually 6 steps to domain admin. So what you should do is use your network security device like a Firebox to also protect your internal users. Using VLANs or physical interfaces, you can have many different segmented trusted networks that have different levels of trust. You can do it by department, by level of sensitivity, and you can apply rules between each of these networks, including all of our security services. And it gives you an opportunity that even if, for instance, segment your IoT. Even if a zero-day attack pops one of your IoT devices, if you have your IoT devices separated from your trusted workstations, and you have the right policies that limited the connection between the IoT device and the user, other than what it needed to do its job, you would limit the attacker's ability to bounce from that IoT network to the rest of your network. So zero trust network segmentation helps a lot. So let's move on to the next section, which is a top news story. This quarter, we talked about Kaseya's ransomware, and I'll let Marc share a bit.
Yeah, so again, we gave a bit of a breaking news webinar back when this incident first occurred. I highly recommend checking that one out. But at the time, when it came to the actual vulnerabilities that the attackers exploited in order to gain access to these Kaseya VSA instances and then deploy the ransomware, a lot of what we had assumptions about what the vulnerabilities looked like, and there was some research into like high level, some of the chained attacks that they had to go through, but the details weren't quite available way back then. Luckily, at least for us from a research standpoint, those details are now available. And so the bulk of this section of the report is basically analyzing exactly the chain of vulnerabilities that the attackers used, how they were vulnerable, and how they used that to gain access to these Kaseya VSA instances. So for time's sake, we didn't include a lot of that in this webinar. I'd highly recommend checking out our original Kaseya webinar if you somehow missed that and want a refresher on what happened, and then check out the report if you'd like to see the exact details of how this attack actually worked. Because like, in my opinion, it was actually pretty interesting, the sophistication that the attackers had to go through for some of these, to discover some of these attacks and actually execute the incident.
Meanwhile, Kaseya and the FBI did a pretty good job, and as bad as this attack was when it happened, it actually has a decent ending to the story, a happier ending than it could have been.
100%.
So transitioning again, the final thing we want to cover really quickly before going through the last defense tips is talking a little bit about endpoint in our remaining 10 or so minutes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marc to start.
Yeah, and real quick, I'm going to answer a QA question that we got pretty early on, which is, are we integrating data from Panda into our threat feeder report yet? And this section is built based off of the Panda 8360 endpoints that we have reporting back to us, as well as WatchGuard EPDR as well. So yes, it is 100% thanks to Panda that we're able to see these endpoint detections now and talk about them in this report. We highlight a few high-level areas when it comes to endpoint detections. And the first one is, how is malware originating on an endpoint? And so when we say infection origin, we mean, what is that initial exploit or method or whatever the attacker used in order to deliver malware onto the system? You'll see that when we look at it on a linear scale like this, script-based attacks and script-based origins basically blows everything else out of the water. Like, we talk about office malware or office droppers as a critical area you need to watch out for, and that's 100% for certain. Things like Java and Adobe are still kicking around and still have vulnerabilities of their own. Even browser attacks are at least a slightly bigger blip. But when it comes to script-based threats, it's really insane the amount of threats that tend to originate from this. We talked about this last year at the end of 2020, where script-based attacks had gone up something like 900%, I think, from the previous year. And now at the end of September of 2021, we've already reached 110% of the previous year's totals. And the reason is, these style of attacks, these living off the land attacks, work really well at basically using the tools built into our operating systems like PowerShell or the Bash shell, other scripting engines built into Microsoft and OS X and Linux, and basically allows attackers to build their malware in just a script that runs entirely in memory. It never drops a executable onto the storage of your system, which makes it pretty difficult for some traditional endpoint protections to identify and block. When it comes to script-based threats, this is where EDR tends to come in, or where you're able to watch not just things or block attacks from executing, but watch processes as they execute and look for suspicious behavior. Like, you can't just typically block PowerShell from running on a Windows computer without hamstringing your IT department's ability to actually do their job. But what you can do is watch PowerShell execute and watch exactly what PowerShell is doing, so that if suddenly it starts disabling your anti-malware services or making a bunch of network requests out to different shady resources, you can raise enough red flags and stop that attack from executing. Corey, anything you want to add before hopping into our next polling question?
No, in fact, I'm going to speed up a little to see if we can finish close to time and still have time for questions. But with the polling question, let me ask really quickly, do you enforce application updates on user workstations?
So what we're talking about with this is, like, when it comes to your application software, the stuff that you have installed, like Office or your web browser, do you, through some administrative or IT control, enforce updates to those applications, or do you rely on your users updating them themselves?
The difference here might be, sure, you might turn on Microsoft's automatic updates, but you have a lot of software that's not Microsoft. Are you doing the updates for those as well? And it looks like the polling has ended. We're just waiting to see if we can see results. And it looks like 69% of you said yes, which is fantastic. 31% of you say no, which is something to look into. I would suggest looking into software that can automatically update not just the operating system, not just the well-known programs, but any program. This is where, you know, we're a threat team that encourages you to use any security you have, but if you happen to have Panda's Adaptive Defense 360 or WatchGuard's EPDR, there is a patch management module. And the beauty of the patch management module is it will capture all the programs on your computer. So sure, you might have Microsoft and Adobe auto update on using the built-in, you know, capabilities, but what about VLC, or what about some random program you grab from the internet? The patch management module can capture all that and can really kind of make it easier to protect against malware that's trying to leverage any issues in that software. With that poll question gone, let's quickly cover browser-originated malware, Marc.
Yeah, one of the reasons we asked that question is we actually saw a huge spike in attacks targeting Internet Explorer specifically over the course of last year. I guess this would be 2020, so a year and a half ago now. And that's despite Internet Explorer having across the world a significantly smaller market share than things like Chrome or Firefox. And so keeping your browser updated specifically is one of the best things you can do to protect against a lot of these attacks. Because like Corey mentioned, there's different browser exploit kits out there where all it takes is for you to accidentally or unknowingly visit a malicious website, and they can potentially gain code execution on your entire system. With that, let's pivot to the last section of our endpoint data, and Corey will take this one.
Yeah, and that is ransomware. And kind of as predicted, while we've seen the volume of ransomware drop from the 2018, we did predict in the last few reports that we expected 2021 to grow well over 2020, and even in Q3 it already has. As you can see, we're in the millions and millions of ransomware. We're already over 2020, but we're projected to grow even more for the rest of the year. So we won't cover, and you guys know what ransomware is. We're going to take a little break from talking about it in too much detail. But the truth is it's very effective monetarily for bad guys, so they're definitely using it a lot more. And with that, why don't we round out with the final takeaways really quickly. I'll start with layers of anti-malware are key. If you've listened to this webinar, you've heard that we have 3 different layers of network-based anti-malware, as well as our endpoint-based anti-malware. And Marc, we talked about all of this. The zero-day malware stat of almost 70%. 70% of malware is not being caught by GAV, Gateway Antivirus, which is all you get with our basic security package. You need total security to have the machine learning based or behavioral malware protection that's catching the bulk of this. And in WatchGuard, that means total security. People that add that to their Firebox are catching more malware than those that don't. And that will translate to your own products. Like if you're not using WatchGuard signature-based anti-malware, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. It's quick at catching the noise, but use something behavioral to catch everything else. And same with the endpoint land. You know, preventative anti-malware protection is great, but unless you have EDR, endpoint detection response, that's supposed to catch an additional layer of malware post-execution, you may be missing some things.
And then next up is supply chain attacks are here to stay. And what we mean by this is Kaseya has proven, unfortunately to them, that this style of attack is a really good way for attackers to get a lot of bang for their buck. Basically, they can go after a single organization, invest their resources into attacking through them, and then use that to hit a huge number of basically end users or end customers. Whether that be targeting managed service providers like you potentially listening, or the software that you use in order to basically start these attacks. Now, it's difficult to defend against technology supply chain attacks because we have a lot of inherent trust for some of the systems that we purchase and install, basically. And so some of the things you can do is, like Corey mentioned earlier, using that zero trust network architecture is a great first start. Using least privilege principle, basically don't expose things that you don't have to. The only way the attackers were able to get into Kaseya VSA instances were if they were exposed directly to the internet. So if you had just taken the step of setting up a mobile VPN to protect it behind that, you are potentially immune to that specific attack. And you'll see that going forward as well. If you add additional layers of protection, you have a chance of limiting the impact of some of these supply chain attacks as attackers continue going after them. Corey, you want to take the last one?
Yeah, and I'll make this one really short. We're mostly referring to the Microsoft products require attention, mostly referring to the auto discover issue. If you have an Exchange server on premise or off premise, make sure to do the configuration we mentioned before, not use basic HTTP auth, and also make sure not to use auto discover. But in general, pay attention to Microsoft's monthly security releases and make sure your users are aware of the Office document issue. Office documents are not benign. They can be one of the big vectors to get malware in your network. While we see them a little less on the endpoint compared to script-based attacks, we see them quite a bit at the network level. So make sure you harden all your Microsoft products and your users are aware of those issues. And that is this quarter's report. Thank you guys for watching. I want to go quickly and say there's lots of ways you can learn more about us by going to seclicity.org, where we share all these resources you see here. Since it's already past 9, I'll let some of you go, but me and Mark can stay a bit if there's any questions.
Yep, and there's a few questions in here. We'll try and answer as many as we can, and the rest we'll see if we can get to you through email potentially after the fact. There were a couple I wanted to point out here first. One of them was when would you recommend using the Firebox for segmenting multiple networks, and when would you recommend using a switch or routing ACL instead? When it comes to, I'm assuming, a zero trust approach to network architecture. And I'd say that the biggest factor in this is you're trying to restrict on a network level access between resources from a user and what they can potentially get access to. Meaning, yes, if you can do that on the Firebox and then also apply security services, that's great. But if the routing is just done through your router and they still have network level access to that resource, you need to make sure you've got ACLs then on that resource as well. Because one of the biggest things about zero trust is basically limiting that initial network access, where yes, maybe your source code repository is protected with authentication, but if I have network access to that as an accountant, that means that if my endpoint gets infected, the attacker has network access to that source code repository too. And all it takes is one vulnerability or one brute force credential to allow them to potentially log into that host.
I share all of what you said, Mark. I did want to point out one of the reasons I still recommend you use something like a Firebox. You'll have to do stuff on your switch, but you're going to allow more things between two trusted networks than you would trust an internal. Even if you're segmenting, you're going to allow more things between your IoT network to your workstation network out of pure necessity to get IoT to work. So besides the stuff Mark, he mentioned the security services. The main thing you want is, even if you're allowing things, you need a gateway that has the opportunity to apply IPS again, has the ability to apply malware detection again for payloads. So I would recommend using your Firebox for sure as part of it, even if you have some switch-based stuff, because you will allow stuff when it's internal, and you want the security services to have a chance to apply to whatever you allow.
Yes, definitely. There's two other big ones I'd like to answer in here. First is a question about DNS Watch and how aggressive the service is and the potential likelihood of it impacting legitimate services. One thing I'll mention is we have a team of researchers behind DNS Watch that curates these threat feeds and responds to any potential false positives quickly, but also just makes sure that we have good data going into the threat intelligence feeds for the service. And what that means is, yes, it's not a completely void of potential false flags, but those are caught really quickly to limit any potential impact. So it is a safe service to turn on, and I'd say it's a really important service to turn on to catch a lot of these attacks very early on before the connection is able to actually build. And the last two are really questions about HTTPS inspection and decryption. There's a question about documentation for it if you're a WatchGuard customer, and another about performance being a potential issue when enabling the service. And I guess I'll address both of those a little separately. The first being the performance question. At least on the Firebox, we tend to fare fairly well. If you ever read the studies from Gartner or NSS Labs or whatever replaced NSS Labs after they disappeared off the face of the earth, you'll notice one of the things they test is security performance with HTTPS inspection enabled. And we've recognized for a very long time how important inspection is and devoted a lot of resources to make sure our crypto module is able to handle that with a limited performance impact. So definitely enable it if you have the ability to. Yes, it does. It's not a 0% performance impact, but we've done the best of our ability to limit that potential impact. The next question was on documentation. If you check out our KBs and our technical documentation for HTTPS inspection, we've done a lot of work over the last 3-4 years or so of making sure that there is a good start to finish guide for enabling content inspection, because again, we recognize it's not a simple feature of just check a box and enable it. There is some work that needs to be done, and we've done our best to make sure that you have an easy to follow guide from start to finish for it. And I'll say if you get stuck anywhere, definitely open up a case and we'll help you out through it and work to improve the documentation based off of what you got stuck on too. I think that's just about it. Last question really was, when it comes to Microsoft Office, do you need to enforce everyone to update to the latest patches and updates? And I'd say yes. This is where tools that have patch modules like AD360 come in to help you with that and help enforce these updates. Because specifically with Office, some of these vulnerabilities make it really easy for an attacker to trick someone with a phish into gaining access to the computer through a tainted document. So anything else you want to add, Corey? Otherwise, we can answer anything else that comes in through email potentially, but thank you all.
Yeah, I think that's it for today for people's time. Do know that your questions are shared with us after too, so we might have a chance to answer an email, but thank you all for joining us from wherever you are and hope you have a great day.
Thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. Just one more thing before you go. At the end of the webinar, a survey is going to pop up. So please try to fill it, because we would love to hear from you what you think about this webinar and any other recommendations that you may have. Have a great day. Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Mark, again for this.
One thing I forgot to mention is I can't remember if we said the report is actually publishing at midnight our time tonight. So we don't have it shared in the channel today, but you can go get it tomorrow morning wherever you are. Sorry, we didn't share that earlier. Thank you, Alicia. And bye all.
Thank you. Bye.